"This is my house," I said, and the man holding my front door keys just smiled like I was the one who didn't belong there. The salt air hit me before I even stepped out of the truck, thick and familiar, that sharp, clean scent of ocean water and sun-warmed wood that used to mean I was home. I'd been gone 11 months, working a coastal infrastructure project up in Oregon, counting down the days until I could come back to this place. My place. The beach house my father built with his own hands, 12 feet above the high tide line, every beam measured twice, every nail driven with intention. I still remember the sound of his hammer echoing over the waves when I was a kid. That sound was gone now, replaced by something wrong. Voices. Laughter. The scrape of furniture moving across hardwood that I knew every inch of. I killed the engine, gravel crunching under my boots as I stepped out, and that's when I saw the new paint. Different shade. Too bright. Too clean. Like someone had erased the years that lived in those walls. My chest tightened before I even reached the porch. The welcome mat was gone. The wind chimes my dad hung by the door gone. In their place, a stainless steel lock I'd never seen before. I tried my key anyway. Metal met metal with a hollow, useless click. Wrong. That's when the door swung open from the inside. A man about my age stood there barefoot, holding a set of keys that should have been mine. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of the living room. My living room. Furniture rearranged, photos missing, the old oak table replaced with something glass and modern. "Can I help you?" he asked, calm, like this was normal. Like I was the stranger. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but my voice stayed level. "Yeah," I said. "You can start by telling me why you're standing in my house." He didn't flinch, didn't even hesitate, just lifted the keys slightly, like proof. "We bought it," he said. "Bought it." The word didn't land right. It slid past my ears like something that didn't belong in the sentence. "Bought it." I stared at him, then past him, trying to anchor myself to something familiar. The curve of the staircase, the way the light came in from the west-facing windows, but even that felt different now. Altered. Rewritten. "That's not possible," I said, quieter this time. The ocean roared behind me, louder than I remembered, like it was trying to fill the silence stretching between us. "It was listed through the HOA," he added, almost casually. "Everything checked out. Clean title, quick close. HOA." The word hit harder than the ocean wind. I could almost smell Maggie Holloway's perfume just hearing it. Sharp, expensive, and always just a little too strong. My grip tightened around my keys, the ones that didn't work anymore. "You might want to call whoever sold you this place," I said slowly, each word measured. "Because they didn't have the right to sell it." He shifted then, just slightly, the first crack in his confidence. But it was already too late. I could feel it settling in my gut, that cold, precise certainty I'd learned on job sites and in courtrooms and in every situation where something didn't add up. This wasn't a mistake. This was an assumption. And whoever made it had just made a very expensive one. I did not argue with him right away because I have learned something over the years working coastal projects and dealing with permits, zoning boards, and more paperwork than most people will ever see in a lifetime. When something feels wrong, you do not react. You observe, you listen, and you let people reveal exactly how deep the mistake goes. The wind pushed against my back as I stood there on that porch, staring at a stranger living inside a house that had been part of my life longer than I could remember. And for a second, I let myself breathe in the details. The uneven groove in the third floorboard near the entrance that I used to trip over as a kid. The faint outline on the wall where my father's old fishing map used to hang. Even the way the sunlight hit the hallway at a sharp angle around this time of day. Nothing about this place had ever been random. Everything had a story, and none of those stories included it being sold. "What is your name?" I asked, calm, steady, like I was asking a question at a job site instead of standing in front of a legal disaster. "Daniel," he said, still holding those keys like they meant something, like possession was 9/10 of the law. "Daniel," I repeated, nodding slightly. "How long ago did you close?" He hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. I ran the timeline in my head automatically, like checking measurements against a blueprint. 3 weeks ago, I was standing knee-deep in salt water up in Newport, signing off on a shoreline stabilization report, logging 12-hour days, sleeping in a rented trailer with the constant hum of generators outside my window. I had not signed anything. I had not authorized anything. I had not even received a notification. Who handled the sale? I asked. HOA management. He said, like that answered everything. Of course it did. Willowbrook Coastal Association. Maggie Holloway's kingdom. I could see her in my head clear as day. The tailored blazer, the perfectly measured smile. The way she spoke like every sentence came with fine print you could not see until it was too late. My father never trusted her. Said people who talked about community standards that much were usually building something for themselves, not for the community. I used to think he was being cynical. Standing there on that porch, listening to the ocean crash behind me and a stranger explain how my home had been sold out from under me, I realized he had been exactly right. I stepped back off the porch slowly, boots hitting the sand worn with steps, and pulled my phone out of my pocket. My hands were steady, but there was a tightness in my chest that felt like pressure building behind a sealed wall. I am going to make a few calls, I said, more to myself than to Daniel, but loud enough for him to hear. He shifted again, less certain now, like the foundation under his confidence had started to move. Look, everything was legal, he added quickly. We went through title, escrow, all of it. I nodded once, already dialing. I believe that you think that, I said. The line rang as I stared past him into the house, into the place where my father taught me how to read tide charts and fix broken hinges and understand that ownership was not just about paper, it was about knowing exactly what you had and why it could not be taken. The call connected, and I could almost hear the gears starting to turn somewhere far away in an office that smelled like polished wood and expensive coffee. Maggie, I said when she answered, my voice calm, controlled, the way it always got right before something irreversible happened. We need to talk about a house you think you sold. There was a pause on the other end of the line, just long enough to tell me she recognized my voice before she said a single word, and when Maggie Holloway finally spoke, it came out smooth, controlled, like she had already decided how this conversation was going to end. Ethan, she said, drawing my name out like it belonged to a list she kept somewhere. I was wondering when you would reach out. I could hear the faint clink of glass in the background, maybe ice against a tumbler, maybe just something staged to sound casual, like she was not in the middle of something that should not have happened in the first place. You sold my house, I said, keeping my tone even, watching Daniel in the doorway as he pretended not to listen. No, she corrected immediately, not a hint of hesitation. The association processed a transfer of an abandoned property in accordance with community bylaws. There it was. Not sold. Transferred. Not mine. Abandoned. Words designed to reshape reality just enough to make it sound legal. The ocean wind picked up, carrying the low hum of waves crashing against the shoreline, and I could feel that pressure in my chest tighten just a little more. I have been paying every tax bill, every assessment, every fee on time for years, I said. There is nothing abandoned about that property. She let out a soft, almost sympathetic exhale, the kind people use when they think they are explaining something obvious to someone who just does not understand. Ethan, the board reviewed your case carefully, she said. No occupancy for over 10 months, no response to multiple notices, visible deterioration. It met the criteria. I looked at the house again, at the fresh paint, the replaced fixtures, the complete erasure of anything that had made it mine, and something about the word deterioration almost made me laugh. You sent notices to a house you were claiming was abandoned, I said. That is your argument. Another pause, shorter this time. We followed procedure, she replied, her voice tightening just a fraction, like the script was being challenged. And the property has already been legally transferred to new owners. This is not something that can simply be undone. I nodded slowly, even though she could not see me, because that sentence told me everything I needed to know. Not something that can be undone. That was not a legal statement. That was a hope. Maggie, I said, stepping off the last stair and onto the sand, the grains shifting under my boots as the tide rolled in closer than usual. You made an assumption. I could hear it now, the faint edge creeping into her silence, the moment where confidence starts to look a little less certain. I am not sure what you think is happening here, she said, a little sharper now. But the association has full authority under Section 12 to manage abandoned coastal properties. Section 12. I closed my eyes for half a second, not out of frustration, but because I knew exactly what was written in that section. I had read every line of those bylaws the day my father signed them, standing at the same kitchen table that was no longer inside that house. You might want to read the part that comes after that, I said quietly. The part about shoreline easements and retained ownership rights. The wind carried the sound of the tide pushing higher up the beach, closer to the foundation than it had been when I arrived. And for the first time since she picked up the phone, Maggie did not respond right away. And that silence was the first real sign that whatever she thought she had done, she had not thought it all the way through. I kept the phone to my ear for a second longer, letting that silence sit where her answer should have been. Then I ended the call without another word because I did not need to hear what excuse she was about to construct next. I already knew how this was going to unfold. The tide had crept in another few feet, the waterline now licking at the darker band of sand that marked the edge of where dry ground ended, and the ocean started reclaiming what belonged to it. And that detail mattered more than anything Maggie had just said. I turned back toward the house, toward Daniel still standing in the doorway, his confidence thinner now, stretched tight over something he was starting to realize he did not fully understand. You might want to call your agent, I told him, slipping my phone back into my pocket. Because this situation is about to get complicated. He frowned, glancing back over his shoulder like he expected someone inside to explain this for him. But there was no one there who could. We have a valid deed, he said, a little more defensive now. Title insurance cleared everything. I nodded once, slow, measured. I believe you, I said. That does not mean it is correct. The wind shifted again, stronger this time, carrying a colder edge as the clouds began to roll in from the horizon, and I could hear the deeper rhythm of the ocean changing. That low, steady pulse that told you the tide was not just coming in, it was pushing harder than usual. My father used to say you could tell a lot about the next few hours just by listening to the water, not watching it, listening. I stepped off to the side of the porch, eyes tracing the line where the sand met the reinforced pilings under the house. And there it was, the detail Maggie had either ignored or never understood in the first place. The structure was built on elevated supports, anchored according to a specific coastal setback line, one that shifted depending on tidal reach and erosion patterns, and more importantly, one that tied directly into the shoreline easement agreement filed with the county decades ago. That easement did not just protect the land. It defined it. It meant the boundary was not fixed by a fence or a survey stake, but by the natural movement of the water itself. I could feel it now, the entire situation snapping into focus the way a blueprint does when the measurements finally line up. Daniel, I said, turning back toward him, did anyone explain to you how coastal easements work in this area? He shook his head slowly, uncertainty replacing whatever certainty he had arrived with earlier. They said everything was standard, he replied. Of course they did. Standard only works when you are dealing with land that stays still. This land never did. I took a few steps closer to the edge of the wet sand, watching the water roll in and then pull back, each wave reaching just a little farther than the last, and I could already see the problem Maggie had created starting to surface, not in paperwork, not in arguments, but in something far more permanent. The house was not just a structure. It was positioned based on conditions that gave me retained control over a shifting boundary, one that no HOA clause could override, no matter how confident they sounded on paper. This is not about the house, I said quietly, more to myself than to him, but loud enough that he could hear it. It is about where the land actually begins. Another wave came in, stronger, pushing water farther up the beach until it brushed against the base of the lowest support beam before receding again, leaving behind a darker, wetter line that had not been there when I arrived. That line was not random. It was evidence. And standing there with the ocean rewriting the boundary in real time, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Maggie Holloway had not just made a paperwork mistake. She had built her entire decision on land that did not belong to her to define. I stood there long enough to watch 3 more waves roll in, each one pushing just a little farther than the last, leaving behind that darker line in the sand that most people would not notice, but that meant everything if you knew what you were looking at. And I realized something that made the situation both simpler and more complicated at the same time. I was not going to win this by arguing on a porch or explaining coastal law to a man who had just moved in 3 weeks ago, because right now, on paper, everything probably looked clean, signed, processed, and filed. I turned back toward the house and walked up the steps again, slower this time, taking in every detail they had changed, the new fixtures, the polished handles, the smell of fresh sealant that still lingered in the air like something rushed, something done quickly to make it look permanent. Daniel stepped aside instinctively as I reached the doorway, not inviting me in, but not stopping me either, caught somewhere between ownership and doubt. I did not cross the threshold. Not yet. You said 3 weeks. I repeated, leaning slightly against the doorframe, feeling the grain of the wood under my fingers, the same wood my father had sanded down himself decades ago. Yeah, he said, watching me carefully now. Closed fast. Cash offer. HOA said it had to move quickly due to liability concerns. I let out a quiet breath through my nose. Almost a laugh, but not quite. Liability. That was new. Did they mention anything about coastal setback compliance? I asked. He shook his head again, slower this time. No. Should they have? I nodded once. Yes, I said simply. They should have mentioned a lot of things. I pulled my phone back out, scrolling through files I had not opened in years but had never deleted, because my father taught me that anything tied to land, water, or ownership was never something you threw away. The screen reflected the gray sky above as I opened the scanned copy of the original coastal agreement, the one signed in 1987 when the county first started regulating shoreline development in this area. I turned the phone slightly so Daniel could see, not because I expected him to understand it immediately, but because I wanted him to see that there was more to this than whatever paperwork he had been handed. This house, I said, tapping the screen lightly, is not just a structure on a fixed lot. It is tied to a variable boundary. That means the legal definition of where this property begins and ends moves with the shoreline. He frowned, trying to follow, but I could see it was not landing yet. That was fine. It would. And here is the part they definitely did not explain to you. I continued, scrolling to the section I knew by memory even before reading it again. The owner of the shoreline easement retains primary control over any land that falls within that shifting boundary. I looked up at him then, letting that sink in. That owner is me. The wind pushed through the open doorway, carrying the sound of the ocean deeper into the house. And for a moment, everything felt suspended, like the air itself was waiting to see what came next. So what does that mean? Daniel asked finally, his voice quieter now, stripped of the certainty he had started with. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and stepped back off the porch again, turning toward the water where the tide had climbed even higher, brushing the lowest support beam once. More before retreating. It means, I said, watching that line in the sand redraw itself again, that the part of this property they thought they had the right to sell is not where they think it is. I paused for a second, letting the weight of that settle, not just for him, but for myself, because I knew exactly what it implied. And it also means, I added, glancing back at the house, at the fresh paint and the new locks and the assumption built into every decision Maggie had made, that everything they just transferred might be sitting on land they never had the authority to include. The ocean answered with another steady crash against the shore, louder now, closer, like it was confirming what I already knew. This was no longer just a dispute. This was a structural mistake. And the kind of mistake that does not stay hidden once the tide comes in. I did not stay on the porch after that because standing there explaining tidal boundaries to someone who had just signed closing papers was not going to fix anything. And more importantly, it was not where the real fight was going to happen. I stepped back onto the sand and walked parallel to the shoreline, boots sinking slightly with each step as the wet ground shifted under my weight, letting the rhythm of the ocean settle my thoughts into something structured, something usable. Daniel stayed near the doorway, watching me now, not like I was a trespasser anymore, but like I was a problem he had not planned for. That was fair. None of this had been planned correctly. I pulled my phone out again, not to call Maggie this time, but to open the county records portal, the same one I had used dozens of times for work, the same system that did not care about HOA interpretations or convenient assumptions, just filings, timestamps, and legal boundaries. The screen loaded slowly under the weak coastal signal, but when it came through, it showed exactly what I expected, the original parcel map, the recorded easement, and the updated shoreline variants filed after the last major storm 5 years ago. That update was the piece most people missed. I zoomed in, tracing the line with my finger, comparing it to what I could see in front of me, the current water reach, the angle of erosion, the position of the support beams under the house. It was not subtle. The active boundary had shifted inland by several feet since that last filing, which meant the legal definition of where that property existed had shifted with it. I stopped walking and turned back toward the house, lining everything up in my head the way I would on a job site when something did not match the plan. The structure itself was now partially within the controlled easement zone, which was still under my retained authority, not the HOA's. That was the assumption. They had treated the lot like it was fixed. It never was. I walked back toward the porch, slower now, not because I was unsure, but because I was certain, and certainty has its own pace. Daniel met me halfway down the steps this time, like he did not want to stand too far inside anymore. "Is this something that can be fixed?" he asked, and there was no confidence left in his voice now, just a question that did not have a simple answer. I looked past him into the house again, at the clean lines, the updates, the money that had already been put into making it theirs, and I understood exactly what was about to happen next, not emotionally, but structurally. "Not the way you think," I said. "This is going to involve the county, probably a tidal review, and definitely a legal challenge." He exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair like he was trying to rewind 3 weeks of decisions in a few seconds. "We just moved in," he said. "We already started renovations." I nodded once. "I can see that," I replied, glancing at the new finishes again, the changes layered over something that had not been theirs to change. The wind picked up harder now, rattling something loose along the side of the house, a hollow knocking sound that echoed under the structure with each gust, and I knew that sound too. It meant the tide was pushing higher, faster than normal. I stepped off the bottom stair again and pointed toward the waterline. "You see how far that is coming in?" I asked. He followed my gaze, squinting slightly as another wave rolled up, reaching the same point it had just minutes ago, consistent, deliberate. "Yeah," he said. "It is higher than when you got here." I nodded. "That line," I said, "that is not just water. That is the boundary your paperwork does not account for." He looked back at me, and I could see it finally settling in, not fully understood, but felt, the realization that something bigger than a simple transaction was unfolding. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and took one last look at the house, at everything that had been changed, everything that had been assumed, and everything that was about to be questioned. This was no longer about proving ownership. That part was already decided. This was about proving that the sale itself had been built on a definition of land that did not legally exist the way they thought it did, and once that came apart, everything connected to it would follow. By the time the next set of waves rolled in, I had already moved past the question of whether this was a mistake and into how deep it went, because there is always a difference between something being wrong and something being systematically wrong, and everything I had seen so far pointed to the second. I stepped a few feet back from the waterline and crouched slightly, running my fingers through the damp sand where the last wave had reached, feeling how soft it was, how recently it had been covered, and that detail triggered something in the back of my mind that I had not connected yet. Not just the boundary. Timing. I stood up again and pulled my phone out, reopening the county records and this time digging deeper, not just at the property file, but at the timeline of filings, the sequence of updates that should have been reviewed before anything like a transfer was even considered. The wind picked up harder, pushing against my jacket as I scrolled, and then I saw it, a supplemental shoreline adjustment filed 8 days before the sale closed. 8 days. My thumb hovered over the screen as I opened the document, already knowing what it was going to show before it fully loaded. The updated measurement confirmed a seasonal shift in the high tide line, not dramatic to anyone who did not know what it meant, but legally significant enough to change the classification of part of the structure into the controlled easement zone. I let out a slow breath, not because I was surprised, but because it confirmed the one thing Maggie could not afford to have ignored. She had processed the transfer after a boundary change that reduced the portion of the property she could legally claim authority over. I turned the phone slightly, angling it toward Daniel again as he stepped closer, drawn in now by something he could sense even if he did not fully understand it yet. "This was filed 8 days before your closing," I said, tapping the date at the top of the document. "Did anyone disclose this to you?" He leaned in, eyes scanning the screen, then shook his head slowly. "No," he said. "We got the standard disclosures. Nothing about this." Of course he did. Standard disclosures for a non-standard property. I straightened up, slipping the phone back into my pocket as the weight of it all settled into something precise, something that could be used. This was the crack. Not just a technicality, but a sequence error, a failure to account for a change that directly affected what was being sold. They sold you a version of this property that no longer existed the way they described it. I said, my voice steady, cutting through the wind and the sound of the ocean. Daniel looked back at the house, then at the waterline, then at me, and I could see the shift happening in real time. The moment where belief turns into doubt and doubt turns into concern. So what happens now, he asked. I glanced down the beach, following the curve of the shoreline where similar houses stood further back from the water, untouched by this exact problem because their boundaries had not shifted the same way. This one had, and that made all the difference. Now, I said, it becomes a matter of record. Another wave came in, stronger than the last, reaching that same darkened line and holding there for a second longer before pulling back, and I knew that line was going to keep moving, inch by inch, reinforcing the very thing Maggie had failed to recognize. I turned back toward the house one more time, not with frustration, but with clarity, because at this point, the outcome was no longer uncertain, only the process was. They assumed the land stayed still, I said quietly, almost to myself. It never does. And with that realization locked in place, I knew exactly where this was heading, not to an argument, not to a conversation, but to a correction that was already beginning to right itself with every inch of water that reached a little farther up the shore. Once you understand where the fault line is, everything else becomes a matter of pressure, timing, and letting the system do what it is designed to do. And I could feel that shift happening as clearly as the tide moving in front of me. I stepped away from the waterline and walked back toward my truck, not in a hurry, not reacting, just moving with purpose now that the pieces had aligned. The gravel crunched under my boots again as I reached the tailgate and pulled out the slim black folder I always kept with me on coastal jobs, the one that held printed copies of permits, surveys, and any document that mattered when the signal dropped and digital access was not enough. I flipped it open, the pages catching the wind for a second before settling. And there it was, the original shoreline easement agreement, stamped, signed, recorded decades before Maggie Holloway ever decided she had authority over anything out here. I ran my thumb along the edge of the paper, feeling the slight roughness where the ink had pressed into it, and for a moment I could almost hear my father's voice again, telling me to always keep the original close, because copies can be challenged, but originals speak for themselves. I closed the folder and walked back toward the house. Daniel watching me the entire time now, not defensive anymore, just trying to understand what he had stepped into. There is something you need to do, I said as I reached the bottom of the steps. Call your title company. Right now. He did not argue. He pulled his phone out immediately, stepping a few feet away as he dialed, his voice low but urgent as he tried to explain a situation he did not have the language for yet. I did not listen to the details. I did not need to. I already knew what that call was going to trigger. Title insurance is built on one assumption, that what was sold matches what legally exists, and the moment that assumption breaks, everything tied to it starts to unravel. I stepped back toward the water again, holding the folder under my arm, and watched as another wave rolled in, steady, predictable, reaching that same darkened line and holding for a second longer than before. The wind had shifted fully now, carrying a cooler edge that meant the tide cycle was not done climbing yet. Behind me, I could hear Daniel's voice change as the person on the other end of the line started asking questions he could not answer, specific questions about disclosures, about surveys, about whether any recent filings had been reviewed before closing. That was the system waking up. I turned slightly and glanced back at the house, at the clean lines and the recent changes, and for the first time since I arrived, I did not see it as something taken from me. I saw it as something that had been incorrectly transferred, a problem already in motion toward correction. Daniel ended the call a few minutes later and walked back toward me, his face tighter now, the kind of tension that comes from realizing you are not dealing with a misunderstanding, but with something that has already started to escalate beyond your control. They want documentation, he said. They are asking about any recorded easements and updated boundary filings. I nodded once, lifting the folder slightly. Good, I said. That means they are paying attention. I handed him a copy of the original agreement, not because it belonged to him, but because he needed to see exactly what had been overlooked. Give them that, I said. and tell them to pull the supplemental filing from 8 days before your closing." He took the paper carefully, like it weighed more than it should, and in a way, it did. The ocean answered with another low, steady crash behind us, closer again, more insistent, and I knew that by the time this moved through the proper channels, through tidal review, through county verification, through everything Maggie had tried to shortcut, there would be no version of this where her assumption held up. I looked back out at the water one more time, watching that line redraw itself again, and let the certainty settle in fully. This was no longer something I needed to argue. This was something that was already correcting itself, one document, one call, 1 inch of shifting shoreline at a time. The next call did not come from Daniel, it came from a number I did not recognize, and I knew exactly who it was before I even answered because the system does not stay quiet once it starts moving. I stepped a few feet away from the house again, the wind pushing harder now, carrying that low, steady roar of the ocean that had shifted from background noise into something that felt like it was marking time. "Ethan Caldwell," I said as I picked up, my voice steady, controlled, already knowing this was not going to be a casual conversation. "This is Laura Jensen with Coastal Title Services." The voice replied, professional, precise, the kind of tone that comes from someone who understands exactly how serious a situation is the moment it crosses their desk. "We just received a call regarding a property transfer that may involve an undisclosed easement and a recent boundary adjustment." I glanced back toward Daniel, who was standing near the steps now, watching me like the outcome of this call was going to define everything that happened next, and in a way, it was. "That is correct," I said, "and I can provide documentation for both." There was a brief pause, the faint sound of typing on the other end, keys moving quickly, pulling records, verifying timelines. "We are reviewing the supplemental shoreline filing dated 8 days prior to closing," she continued. "At first glance, it appears the effective boundary may have shifted into an area previously defined under a retained easement." At first glance. That was the language they used when something was about to become official. "It is not just an appearance," I said, watching another wave push farther up the sand, holding there for a second longer before retreating. "It is recorded and enforceable." More typing. Faster now. The system accelerating. "If that is confirmed," she said, her tone tightening slightly, "then the legal description used in the transfer would not accurately reflect the current condition of the property at the time of sale." I let that sit for a second, because that sentence mattered more than anything else that had been said so far. Not accurate. That is all it takes. "What does that mean for the transaction?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "It means the transfer may be subject to immediate review and potential reversal pending county verification," she said. No hesitation now. No uncertainty. Just process. I nodded once, more to myself than to her. "You are going to want to notify the county recorder and flag the title," I said. "And you are definitely going to want to pull the HOA authority scope tied to that parcel." Another pause, shorter this time, followed by a shift in her tone that told me she understood exactly where this was going. "We will escalate this to legal immediately," she said. "In the meantime, we recommend no further modifications be made to the property until this is resolved." I glanced at the house again, at the fresh paint, the changes already made, and the ones that were probably planned next. "That is already happening," I replied. "You might want to move quickly." I ended the call and slipped my phone back into my pocket, the weight of it lighter now, not because the situation was resolved, but because it had moved out of uncertainty and into procedure. Daniel stepped closer, searching my face for something he could hold on to. "What did they say?" he asked. I looked past him at the house one more time, then back at the shoreline where the tide continued its steady advance, redrawing the boundary with quiet precision. "They said the paperwork does not match reality," I answered. The wind pushed through again, stronger, rattling the structure just enough to remind anyone paying attention that this place was not built on something fixed. It never had been. And now, finally, the people who needed to see that were starting to understand it too. The wind did not let up. It built, steady and deliberate, pushing the sound of the ocean into everything, under the house, through the open doorway, into the silence that had settled between me and Daniel. And for the first time since I arrived, I could feel the situation shifting out of our hands completely and into something larger, something procedural, something that did not care about intentions or assumptions, only what could be proven and what could not. Daniel's phone rang again before either of us said anything else, sharp and immediate, and the way he looked down at it told me everything I needed to know about who was calling. "It is them," he said quietly, already answering, stepping a few feet away like distance might somehow make the conversation easier. I did not follow. I stayed where I was, near the edge of the wet sand, watching the tide reach that same line again, consistent now, repeatable, undeniable. His voice carried just enough through the wind for me to catch fragments. "Yes, we just spoke." "No, they did not mention that." "What does that mean for us?" And then silence as he listened, longer this time. The kind of silence that stretches when the answer is not what you hoped it would be. I did not need to hear the rest. I had heard enough of those calls in my life to know the pattern. First comes the review, then the concern, then the language changes. He turned back toward me slowly, ending the call, his face no longer uncertain, but fully aware of what this had become. "They are suspending the title," he said, each word landing heavier than the last. "They said there is a discrepancy in the legal description tied to a recorded easement and that the county is being notified." I nodded once, not surprised, just confirming what had already been set in motion. "That is how it starts," I said. The house creaked softly behind him as another gust of wind moved through the structure, and for a second we both looked back at it, not as something owned, but as something caught in the middle of a correction. "They also said we might have to vacate if the transfer is deemed invalid," he added, his voice tighter now, the reality settling in fully. I let that sit for a moment, because that part mattered, not just legally, but personally, and this was never about punishing him. It was about undoing something that should not have happened in the first place. "You are not the one who made the mistake," I said, keeping my tone level. "But you are the one standing in the middle of it." He exhaled slowly, looking down at the sand like he was trying to find something stable in a place that did not offer it. "What about the HOA?" he asked. I glanced back toward the road, toward where Maggie's office sat miles away behind glass and polished desks, far from the shifting line of water that was already proving her wrong. "They're going to have to explain how they transferred something they did not have the authority to define," I said. Another wave rolled in, stronger again, reaching the base of the support beam and holding there just a second longer before pulling back, leaving the wood darker, wetter, marked. That mark would not disappear. Not today, not tomorrow. It would be measured, recorded, used. And once that happens, I continued, everything tied to that decision is going to be questioned. Daniel nodded slowly, not because he understood every detail, but because he understood enough to know this was not going to resolve quietly. The wind pushed through again, carrying that deep, steady sound of the ocean that had now become something else entirely, not just background, not just movement, but evidence. I slipped my hands into my pockets and looked out at the water one more time, watching the line redraw itself again, consistent, patient, inevitable. This was no longer about proving a point. It was about letting the truth of the land, the water, and the records align in a way that no assumption could override. And once that alignment was complete, there would be no version of this where the sale held together the way Maggie had intended. It happened faster than most people would expect, not because anyone rushed it, but because once the right pieces are in place, the system does not hesitate. It moves, and it moves in a way that leaves very little room for interpretation. My phone rang again, but this time the number was one I knew by memory, the county office, the same line I had used years ago when my father and I finalized the shoreline documentation that made this entire situation possible. I answered before the second ring finished. "Ethan Caldwell," I said. "Mr. Caldwell, this is Thomas Reed from the county recorder's office." The voice replied, formal, direct, the kind of tone that only comes when something has already been reviewed and verified. I turned slightly away from the house, the wind pressing against my back as the ocean continued its steady advance. "We have received a notification regarding a property transfer involving your coastal parcel," he continued. "We have also reviewed the supplemental shoreline adjustment filed prior to that transfer." I closed my eyes for half a second, not out of stress, but because I knew what came next before he said it. Based on current records, the legal boundary referenced in the transfer documentation does not align with the recorded easement conditions in effect at the time of sale, he said. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just fact. I let the words settle, feeling that quiet shift from dispute to confirmation. What action is being taken? I asked, even though the answer was already clear in my mind. The title has been flagged, and the transfer is being placed under immediate review, he said. Pending full verification, the transaction may be deemed invalid due to misrepresentation of the property boundary. Invalid. That word carried weight. I glanced back at the house, at Daniel standing near the steps, watching me, waiting for something that would define what happened next. And the HOA's authority in this matter? I asked. There was a brief pause, the sound of paper shifting on the other end, and then the answer came, steady and precise. Preliminary review indicates the association exceeded its authority by including land subject to a retained shoreline easement in the transfer, he said. That portion of the parcel remains under your control as recorded. I nodded once, slow, controlled, because that was the core of it, the part Maggie had either ignored or never understood. Thank you, I said, and ended the call. I slipped my phone back into my pocket and turned toward Daniel, the wind catching the edge of his shirt as he stood there, no longer holding on to the idea that this was just a misunderstanding. The county confirmed it, I said, my voice even. The transfer does not match the legal boundary. He swallowed, the reality of it settling in deeper now. So what does that mean for us? He asked. I looked past him at the house one more time, at the structure sitting exactly where it always had, but now clearly inside a boundary that had been misunderstood, misused, and incorrectly transferred. It means the sale cannot stand the way it was processed, I said. The ocean answered with another strong push against the shore, water reaching the base of the supports again, leaving that same dark mark that had become the most honest line on the entire property. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly as the weight of it all settled into something final. And the HOA? He asked again, quieter this time. I turned my gaze toward the horizon for a moment, where the gray clouds had thickened and the water moved with more force than when I first arrived. They are going to have to answer for it, I said, because this was no longer about interpretation or assumption. This was about recorded facts, verified boundaries, and a decision made on land that was never theirs to define. And once that truth was on record, there was no version of this where it could be ignored or explained away. The tide did not argue. It did not negotiate. It just kept moving, marking the line exactly where it belonged, over and over again, until everyone was forced to see it. By the time the next morning came, the air felt different, heavier, not just from the storm that had rolled through overnight, but from the shift that had already taken place in the background, the kind of shift that does not announce itself loudly but shows up in emails, in flagged records, in decisions that start stacking up one after another. I stood on the same stretch of sand, coffee in hand this time, the bitter heat cutting through the cool edge of the wind as the ocean settled into a slower rhythm after the high tide peak. The line was still there, darker, clearer now, etched into the beach like it had always been waiting for someone to finally pay attention to it. Behind me, the house looked the same at a glance, but it did not feel the same anymore, not after everything that had been set in motion. Daniel stepped out onto the porch, no longer holding keys like they meant control, just holding them because he had nowhere else to put them. They sent the notice this morning, he said, his voice steady but worn, like he had not slept much. I turned slightly, taking a sip of coffee before answering. Tidal suspension? I asked. He nodded. And a preliminary determination that the transfer is invalid pending final review, he added. The words sounded formal, distant, but the meaning was immediate. I set the cup down on the railing, the wood still familiar under my fingers despite everything that had happened. That is how it resolves, I said quietly. He leaned against the post, looking out at the water the same way I had been, like he was trying to understand how something that looked so calm could carry so much consequence. They also said the HOA is under investigation for exceeding authority, he continued. I nodded once, not surprised, just acknowledging the next step in a process that had already been written the moment the wrong assumption was made. They built their decision on a fixed line, I said. This place does not have one. The wind moved through again, softer now, carrying the scent of salt and damp wood, and for a moment everything felt still, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that needed to happen was already underway. Daniel let out a slow breath, rubbing the back of his neck as he looked back at the house. "We are packing," he said. "They told us it is best to vacate before the final ruling." I glanced at him, then back at the structure, at the changes that had been made, the effort, the intention, all built on something that had never been stable to begin with. "I am sorry," I said, and I meant it, because he had stepped into something he did not create. He shook his head slightly. "It is not your fault," he replied. "We trusted the wrong people." That was the part that always mattered most, not the mistake itself, but where the trust had been placed. I picked up my coffee again and took another sip, letting the warmth settle as I looked out at the shoreline, at the line that had defined everything without needing to say a word. "The system is correcting it," I said. "It just takes time for it to catch up to reality." He nodded slowly, understanding enough now to accept what was happening even if he did not fully grasp every detail behind it. Another wave rolled in, quieter this time, reaching the same mark and stopping there, like it had found its place. And standing there, watching that line hold steady after everything that had shifted, I knew this was the part most people never see, not the argument, not the confrontation, but the quiet moment when everything aligns and the truth no longer needs to be defended because it is already written into the land itself. 3 weeks later, the house was quiet again, not empty in the way it had been when I first pulled up that day, but settled, like something that had finally been put back where it belonged. The new paint was still there, the updated fixtures still in place, but the energy had shifted, no longer forced, no longer pretending to be something it was not. I stood on the porch early that morning, the same spot where everything had started, the same boards under my boots, the same ocean stretching out in front of me, steady and constant. The air carried that familiar mix of salt and sun-warmed wood again, and for the first time since I arrived, it felt like home in a way that did not need to be questioned. The final notice had come through 2 days earlier, official, recorded, and impossible to ignore. The transfer had been voided, the title restored, the sale unwound as if it had never legally existed in the first place. The language was precise, clean, and final, just the way the system works when it corrects something built on the wrong foundation. Daniel and his family had left quietly the week before. No arguments, no resistance, just a mutual understanding that they had been placed in a situation that was never theirs to carry. I had watched them load the last of their boxes into a rental truck, the sound of the engine fading down the road as the wind picked up again off the water, and there was no anger in that moment, just clarity. They had trusted the process. The process had failed them, and then the process had corrected itself. Somewhere in all of that, Maggie Holloway's name had started showing up in places it had never been before, not in newsletters or HOA meeting notes, but in formal inquiries, in compliance reviews, in documents that did not use polished language or careful phrasing. I did not need to see those details to understand what they meant. Authority only holds as long as it stays within its boundaries, and the moment it crosses that line, the system does not protect it, it examines it. I stepped off the porch and walked toward the water, the sand firm under my feet now, the tide lower than it had been that first day, but the line still visible, still present, still defining everything whether anyone chose to acknowledge it or not. I stopped at that edge and looked back at the house one more time, at the structure that had never moved. Only the understanding of it had. My father used to say that the land always tells the truth if you know how to listen, and standing there with the ocean stretching out in front of me and the house settled back into its place behind me, I finally understood exactly what he meant. This was never about taking something back. It was about letting the truth of what was already mine stand on its own, without noise, without force, without anything except time and the right set of facts. Another wave rolled in, slower now, softer, reaching that same line and stopping there like it had nothing left to prove. I watched it for a moment, then turned back toward the house, toward the place that had been built on shifting ground, but never on uncertain ownership, and I let out a slow breath that carried everything with it. The frustration, the tension, the waiting, all of it settling into something simple and undeniable. They thought the line was fixed. They built everything on that assumption. But the line was never theirs to define, and in the end, it did exactly what it always does. It moved, it revealed, and it made sure the truth could not be ignored.